All right, well, welcome everyone, faculty, staff, students, certainly guests and our speaker. Thank you all for being here today in celebration of the signing of our U.S. Constitution on September 17th, 1787. I'm so glad that you are all here today. Thank you for your support. Thank you for taking time out of your afternoon to be here with us today. Today we will be hearing from Dr. Wilsey, who will share with us the ideas about securing liberty in a democracy. And if you have questions about his presentation, please use the question and answer link on your Zoom page. Submit your questions there. And if we have an opportunity at the end of Dr. Wilsey's presentation, he'll answer as many of those as he possibly can. Before we introduce our speaker today, though, I'd like to take a few minutes and just say a prayer to get us started. Let's pray. Dear gracious Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day and the opportunity to celebrate our Constitution, and particularly the government-sanctioned freedom it gives us to worship and to assemble. I thank you for each individual present via Zoom and the opportunity to meet and learn in spite of the circumstances. For those who are not with us today because they are suffering the effects of COVID, I ask that you heal their bodies, comfort those who have been and are still being physically, mentally, and emotionally impacted by COVID. Thank you for Dr. Wilsey, our speaker. May he touch our hearts and minds with your truths. Be with us, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Phillips to introduce our distinguished speaker today.
It's great to have all of y'all here today, and I want to tell you, you are in for a great time and a special treat. I have the privilege to introduce Dr. John Wilsey. Dr. Wilsey is a graduate of Furman University and holds 2 degrees from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, where he did his MDiv and his PhD. He was a professor of church history at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary's Houston campus, where he and I were colleagues together. And now went on from there to do postdoctoral research at Princeton University, where he did the research for his latest book, God's Cold Warrior, which is about the life and times of John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, a very strong and committed believer, and it's a fascinating book that you need to check out. But it's actually only one of 4 books that he's written. He's written on the relationship between Christianity and the founding of the United States. He's written on American exceptionalism, particularly taking a look at Lincoln's ideas on American exceptionalism and contrasting that with some other possible viewpoints. And he's also written or edited a reader of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which is one of the early great works on American democracy and how it's put together and why it endures. So Dr. Wilsey is now a professor of church history at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And I want to tell you, he's not only a good friend, he's got an acerbic wit, and he's also one of the most brilliant people I know. He's thought deeply about the American Constitution and in thinking about it Christianly, in light of what Scripture has to say about the human condition and God's will and what human flourishing actually ends up looking like. I'm excited to hear from him today, and I hope you'll enjoy him as well. Dr. Wilsey, take it away.
Well, thank you, Dr. Phillips and Dr. Gramling, for that introduction. And thank you so much for this opportunity to be presenting this presentation on Constitution Day for Charleston Southern. And I thank each of you for joining in and for joining us for this consideration of Alexis de Tocqueville and his ideas on what secures liberty in a democracy. Very early in Alexis de Tocqueville's meditation on American democracy, a stark contrast formed in his mind between 2 societies, one French and the other American. The fundamental similarities between these 2 societies were, first, both were seeing the permeation of equality of conditions. And second, revolutions served to accelerate the spread of equality of conditions throughout their respective social, religious, and political institutions. But here the similarities stopped. Revolutions in France yielded disruption, violence, chaos, degradation, and tyranny. Revolution in America yielded stability. America, Tocqueville said, quote, is reaping the fruits of the democratic revolution which we are undergoing without having had the revolution itself. In other words, the revolution of equality of conditions has brought peace and liberty to America, and America has avoided suffering the excesses of the revolution in France that France was continuing to experience during Tocqueville's lifetime. Now for us, Tocqueville and the world he inhabited can both seem very foreign. For one thing, Tocqueville was born in 1805 into an ancient family, one that could trace its roots all the way back 900 years. Most of us have trouble naming our own great-grandparents, but Tocqueville's family could follow its ancestry all the way back to the Norman invasion of England in 1066. Also, Tocqueville was born into a specific position in the aristocratic hierarchy. And yet, while he occupied a position of privilege in a 1,000-year-old feudal order that began its development after the fall of the Roman Empire, he resonated with the idea of equality, provided liberty was secured, maintained, and extended. And lastly, Tocqueville was the product of revolutionary France. His grandparents and parents were victims of the infamous Reign of Terror under Robespierre. He himself was born at the height of Napoleon's power. He was a minor judge at the time of the July Revolution of 1830. And he was a representative in the Chamber of Deputies during the 1848 revolutions in France, 11 years before he died. He came to America in 1831 when Andrew Jackson was finishing his first term as president. Most of the population of the United States was still settled within a couple of 100 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. Slavery dominated the plantation economy of the South. The Second Great Awakening was underway. But the annexation of Texas, trans-Mississippi westward expansion, the Mexican War, the Civil War, even most of the Industrial Revolution, and these were all years in the future for him. But while Tocqueville and his world seem very foreign to us, his observations and his warnings in his writings were remarkably prescient. More than one commentator on Tocqueville's writings has expressed amazement at how practical and insightful they are for our own times. Tutville had a very keen understanding of revolutions, what they were, how they got started, what they promised, how they unfolded, and the results that they brought. For one thing, he studied carefully the history of the 1789 revolution in France. In 1856, he wrote a book entitled The Old Regime and the Revolution, in which he argued that the revolution sought to abolish the existing form of society, and the result was anarchy. But besides this historical and philosophical work, Tocqueville had direct experience of the revolution and its effects, both through his family and his own encounter with revolutions in his lifetime. But the 1789 revolution cast the longest shadow over the Tocqueville family, and this was a shadow that Alexis lived through all of his life. Tocqueville's mother and father were victims of the horror of the French Revolution during the years 1793 to 1794. Hervé de Tocqueville married Louise Marie Pelletier de Rosambeau in 1793. Louise's grandfather, Lamoignon de Malesherbes, had served as defense attorney for Louis XVI before the National Convention, just months before their wedding. But on January 21st, 1793, the king was publicly beheaded at the guillotine set up in the Place de la Révolution, later the Place de la Concorde. And later that year, Hervé and Louise were living at the Malesherbes Chateau, enjoying the first months as husband and wife, when commissioners arrived to arrest and escort to prison the entire family, represented by 3 generations. Their property was confiscated. 4 members of the family were beheaded. The elderly Lamoignon was forced to watch as his daughter was guillotined before he himself was bound to the scaffold and beheaded. Hervé and Louise were scheduled for execution, but they were freed from prison after Robespierre himself was arrested and beheaded. Hervé was only 21 years old, but after 10 months in prison and witnessing the murder of his wife's grandfather, uncle, mother, and aunt, his hair turned completely white. Louise never recovered from the experience. Alexis, the youngest of Hervé and Louise's 3 children, was born in 1805. And some of young Alexis's earliest memories were of his mother's melancholia from the trauma of the revolution. Years later, Alexis described a poignant family scene that gives us an idea of how profound the family's grief was. He said, "I remember today as if it were yesterday. A certain evening in a chateau where my father then dwelt, where a family celebration had gathered to us a large number of our near relatives. The domestics had been sent out. The whole family had collected about the hearth. My mother, who had a sweet voice and penetrating, began to sing an air which had been famous in all our civil troubles and whose words told of the misfortunes of Louis XVI and his death. When she ceased, everyone was weeping, not over the many private misfortunes they had suffered, not even over the many relatives lost in the Civil War and on the scaffold, but over the fate of this man who had died more than 15 years before, and whom most of those who were weeping over him had never even seen. But this man had been the king." The French Revolution, Tocqueville later wrote, in the old regime, sought to destroy a core set of social and political realities. And when it did, everything else was destroyed. One of the other realities that the revolution destroyed was a set of mores, or customs, or manners, cultural habits, informed by tradition and religion, especially respect and proper obedience to legitimate authority. Unfortunately, Tocqueville admitted that many people who confess Christianity betrayed its foundational commitment to human equality. That is, the idea that all people are equal in the sight of God. Too often in the days immediately preceding the revolution, religion had allied itself with tyranny. But not all Christians were guilty of this. Tocqueville wrote that Christians who served as champions of liberty during the revolution in France knew that Christianity served as the basis for liberty because Christianity formed the moral underpinnings of society. Liberty, Tocqueville wrote in the introduction to Democracy in America, cannot be established without morality, nor morality without faith. And in chapter 9, part 2 of volume 1, Tocqueville explained that American society's mores, that is, society's habits of the heart, as he described them, were more influential than anything else in fashioning the ethical assumptions of the culture. The mores were more critical to the success of liberty than even in the laws. Tocqueville observed that American democracy was maintained most generally by the cultivation of federalism, the fostering of township institutions, and the limiting of power of the majority through courts. But the mores were more influential than anything else, not only in the maintenance of democracy, but the protection of liberty and the prevention of tyranny of the majority. And what informed the mores? These most important ideas that undergirded everything in society. In a word, morality informed by Christianity and supported and advanced through freedom of religion. So Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America so that his own countrymen in France could learn lessons from Americans who had experienced a revolution of their own and yet did not see the rise of tyranny that came with the extension of equality of conditions. And by equality of conditions, Tocqueville meant the social, economic, religious, and political mobility in America that resulted in the elimination of traditional hierarchies that continued to be assumed in Europe even in the 19th century. Equality of conditions was the defining characteristic of America. And while Tocqueville largely welcomed the spread of equality of conditions, he did realize that tyranny was particularly threatening in an equal society, because he saw that people would abandon more readily that equality because equality's benefits were easier to come by in comparison to those of liberty. But it was through Christian morality, made ubiquitous because of religious freedom, which informed American mores, that in turn established American democratic practices, which secured and extended liberty. Tocqueville said, "I sought there, in America, the image of democracy itself, with its inclinations, its character, its prejudices, its passions, in order to learn what we have to fear or to hope from its progress." So in what follows, we'll explore two particular democratic practices in American political and social life, and how these practices preserved liberty. And we will then explore how Tocqueville saw the indispensability of religion to the preservation of liberty and democracy, and how religion establishes American mores on which democratic practices were based. And then I'll close with some final thoughts on what's at stake for Americans as they chart their path for the future. Now, Alexis de Tocqueville came to America with his friend Gustave de Beaumont in the spring of 1831. They spent most of their time in New England, New York, Pennsylvania, but they made their way as far south as New Orleans. Their original plan was to spend 2 whole years in America, but they were recalled by the French government and were forced to cut their trip short. And so as a result, they were unable to analyze the southern states to the same extent they were able to do so for the North. And they only spent a total of 9 months in the United States. But those 9 months provided the basis for the most insightful work on American political and social institutions ever written. Now, Tocqueville met Beaumont at law school in 1826, and they became lifelong friends. When Louis Philippe seized power in the July Revolution of 1830, all government officials were required to take loyalty oaths. And so both Tocqueville and Beaumont did so, but they did so reluctantly. After all, Tocqueville's family had been staunch supporters of the Bourbon dynasty for generations, and Louis Philippe had overthrown the last of the Bourbon kings, Charles X, who was the youngest brother of the executed Louis XVI. Had they refused to take the loyalty oath, their careers would certainly have been jeopardized. What's more, Tocqueville and Beaumont, they feared further repercussions. I mean, from their perspective, the July Revolution could have been as destructive to France as the Reign of Terror. Today, we know it didn't turn out that way, but Tocqueville and Beaumont could never have known that. So the two friends hatched an idea that would both advance their careers and get them out from under the watchful eyes of the new government. Their idea was to go to America, study prison reform taking place in New York and Pennsylvania. They pitched their idea to the Ministry of the Interior, and they were given official commissions for their trip to America to study prisons. But their real goal was to study American institutions and culture, and hopefully produce a book-length treatment of the subject. And they did. They produced a book on American prisons entitled On the Penitentiary System in the United States and its Application in France, which won the prestigious Montyon Prize in 1833. But then both travelers produced books of their own on America in addition to their studies of prisons. Tocqueville produced the 2-volume Democracy in America, and Beaumont wrote a novel on American slavery entitled Marie, or Slavery in the United States. Tocqueville's interest in American political institutions and practices began as he listened to lectures in 1829 and 1830 by the celebrated historian Francois Guizot, a professor at the University of Paris. Guizot believed that history followed the law of inevitable progress, namely that society would be defined by the rise of the power of the middle class. Class distinctions of feudalism, church privilege, and hierarchy, monarchical power would all be challenged and undermined, and natural equality would displace natural hierarchy. Guizot's ideas hit Tocqueville like a thunderbolt, and his theories seemed to be confirmed by the events of the July Revolution. Ultimately, what Tocqueville saw in America with regard to the prevalence of equality of conditions there gave credence to Guizot's thesis. So Tocqueville visited New England during the early fall of 1831, and he found in the small towns of that region what he believed were the freest people in America. They had what Tocqueville called a public spirit, and he described this dynamic in Part 1, Chapter 5 of Volume 1 in Democracy in America. Individuals had the sense of having a stake of ownership in their town and their town's flourishing. Each person in the town had strong attachments to their town, not just because they were born into their town, but because they saw themselves as members, and it was worth their time and energy in caring for their town. But what was the origin of this public spirit, which Tocqueville described as, quote, no surer guarantee of order and tranquility, yet nothing more is difficult to create? Tocqueville observed a key characteristic in human nature as he answered this question. People, Tocqueville believed, were naturally drawn towards power. New England townships had power and independence, and the power of the towns emanated not from the top down, but from the bottom up. Power was decentralized, evenly dispersed, so that every citizen had a little bit of power to exercise for the flourishing of the town. For example, in the New England townships, there was a vast number of elected office holders overseeing all kinds of public duties, like tax assessors, road inspectors, constables, and the like. These office holders were chosen directly by the people, and their terms of office were short, and usually no longer than about a year. The effect of this was that the greatest number of people exercised themselves in the direct interests of the town. So office holding in the townships provided beneficial experience for office holding in county and state governments. And furthermore, Tocqueville saw that patriotism was at its strongest at the local level. Democracy functioned in its purest form when it rose from the citizens who chose their own leaders from among themselves to exercise power in the ordinary interests of everyday life in their locality. And the corporate well-being of the town was directly proportional to the citizens' private sense of well-being, which meant that in New England, private interests and public interests were in harmony with one another. The upshot of all this was that democratic practices in New England bubbled up from the citizens. Democracy did not filter down from Washington, D.C. or the state capitals. The practices of democracy became habits of self-government, and those habits were essential to the preservation of liberty and the prevention of tyranny from the federal or state governments. As long as a township had the authority to direct its own affairs that had a real bearing on people's lives, then citizens displayed a vibrant public spirit. Citizens could easily exercise power through direct involvement in decision-making when it came to issues they faced, which would have significant impact on their private and public interests. But if a township lost the power to direct and shape its immediate interests to more distant jurisdictions, then the public spirit of citizens would be adversely affected. If real power was to be held by office holders who did not live in the town and had no interest in the town's prosperity beyond the abstract, then citizens would lose their public spirit because the town's independence was lost. So for Tocqueville, power and independence were logically and historically entailed in the New England townships and the cultivation of public spirit. And because power and independence were so central to local government, liberty was impossible to maintain in a democracy without a local government animated by public spirit. As you read in Tocqueville about public spirit, we see that this concept is directly pertinent to the most basic principle of democracy, which is the principle of the sovereignty of the people. Take the most well-known lines of the United States Constitution, the preamble. We, the people of the United States, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Sovereign power does not reside in the person of any particular office holder in a democracy. It resides with the people. Even the Constitution, which is the highest authority in the United States, does not have sovereignty in and of itself. It is the highest authority in the United States because the people have invested it with that authority. So public spirit is essential to the preservation of liberty in a democracy. Public spirit is found in its most pure form at the most local level and emanates upward to higher levels of government. Public spirit is strengthened when people in a local jurisdiction enjoy independence from more distant jurisdictions and thus have the power to advance their own particular interests. But it's weakened when distant jurisdictions limit a locality's independence over their own affairs and undermine the power of citizens to direct those affairs. When people in a locality look to state and federal authorities that are distant, they become dependent on those distant, centralized authorities and look to their own private interests over those of the larger whole. Selfishness results, and the precarious balance of private interest and public interest is disrupted, and tyranny threatens. Tocqueville saw that public spirit was necessary to the preservation of democracy, a preservation of liberty in a democracy, and he saw how this dynamic was worked out most clearly in New England. The public spirit refers to citizens' sense of ownership, of sovereignty over their own particular community, and it occurs when citizens strike that balance between private interests and public interests. Small sacrifices to private interests are necessary to ensure the benefit of the whole, and sacrifices to public interests are necessary to ensure the benefit of individuals. And this balance is very difficult to maintain over the long term. So how do you maintain the balance? Well, one way is through the voluntary associating together of citizens in the interest of advancing a common goal. So let's talk about voluntary associations then. Tocqueville said in Volume 2 of Democracy in America, Americans of all ages, of all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations. This tendency of Americans, evident everywhere he went in America, amazed Tocqueville. Freely associating together in groups was one of the most profound democratic practices among Americans, Tocqueville observed, as fundamental and important to democracy as serving on a jury in a trial. Americans formed free associations all the time in pursuit of agendas of all kinds, economic, political, religious, moral, civic, you name it. Some associations were large, others were small, but they all have one thing in common. Free associations were the schools of democracy. In a free and voluntary association, Americans got out from isolation. They learned how to work with other people from different backgrounds, and they pursued a common goal in order to foster fellowship, deepen the public spirit, and ultimately persuade others to join their cause and direct public policy. Tutville saw that Americans formed association for all kinds of purposes. They got together to form hospitals when none existed. They formed seminaries. They formed religious colleges, particularly in the Trans-Appalachian West, which was being settled by whites for the first time when he was here. They started inns, prisons, churches, schools. They founded associations to advance the spread of the gospel. And they started societies dedicated to moral causes like temperance and literacy. In Tocqueville's day, some of the most influential associations were like the American Bible Society, the American Board of Foreign Missions, the Sunday School Union, the Temperance Society. There were lots of anti-slavery societies, most notably led by William Lloyd Garrison, who published the journal The Liberator, and Frederick Douglass, who published the journal The North Star. There was the New York Anti-Tobacco Society, and there were hosts of small associations with limited constituencies, such as a relief organization with this interesting name, the Ladies' Association for the Benefit of Gentlewomen of Good Family, reduced in fortune below the state of comfort to which they have been accustomed. Tocqueville noted that voluntary associations form in America because people were used to solving their own problems in coordination with each other, rather than waiting for the government or some rich benefactor to come along and give them aid. Historically, towns were the first organized communities in colonial America. Towns came before counties, and they came before the states, they certainly came before the federal government. And in a town, people organized together to deal with particular issues much more easily because of geographical proximity, because the issues they face together in a town are much closer to their private and public interests. In other words, it's to the individual's interest to make sure the main road, for example, into town is maintained, just as it is to the public's interest. The quality of the road to market has a direct bearing on the flourishing of the individual, just as it has on the flourishing of the community as a whole. Now in France, the local aristocrat took responsibility for a local community's public interests. Tocqueville wrote in the old regime that one of the reasons the Revolution of 1789 got underway was because the aristocrats had given up on their responsibilities to their people by leaving their estates to dwell at the royal court at Versailles. Feudalism had always been a two-way street. Commoners produced foodstuffs and manufactured goods, and they provided manpower for armies. And in return, the aristocracy provided protection and land so that their commoners could produce without hindrance. If feudal relationships broke down, then society as a whole also broke down. The failure of the aristocracy to take care of its responsibilities to the commoners was one of the drivers of revolution, according to Tocqueville. After the revolution, it was the government that took responsibility for local problems and interests, which led to centralization and dependence of the localities on the government in Paris to solve their problems. In England, the aristocracy continued to function in a similar way as was expected in France prior to the revolution. The problem with the government or the aristocracy taking leadership over public projects was that power and initiative started at the top and worked its way down. But in America, the people took their own initiative to secure their private and public interests. Tocqueville said, whenever at the head of some new undertaking, you see a government in France, a man of rank in England, that in the United States, you will be sure to find an association. Voluntary associations protect the community from tyranny on the one hand and anarchy on the other. So what relation was there between voluntary associations and liberty? Well, first, for voluntary associations to work properly, that is, to originate from the local and broaden to larger constituencies, the government had to guarantee freedom to associate. The government also had to guarantee freedom of speech and a free press in order that association might effectively communicate with its membership without any hindrances. And the government had to guarantee freedom of conscience so that any society might be able to craft its own vision, its own agenda, based on its moral and religious beliefs. Beyond guaranteeing those freedoms, the government was to have nothing to do with voluntary associations, not in regulating them, not in dictating their agendas. Secondly, voluntary associations fostered the art of individuals' common pursuit of the object of an association's shared desires. And third, voluntary associations were, in essence, minorities. All associations, no matter how powerful, could boast only a fraction of the entire US population on their membership roll. But in this way, associations protected the rights of minority interests against the overwhelming power of the majority. Associations helped maintain independence from centralized authority by their existence, by their advocacy, and by their powers of persuasion. Tocqueville believed that voluntary associations were the most important guard of civilization against barbarism. The genius of a voluntary association was, and continues to be, found in how a set of people coming from different backgrounds, with different religious beliefs, with sometimes competing political viewpoints, varying educational levels, racial identities, economic levels, can all work together for a common purpose or civic purpose. Take the National Right to Life Committee. The mission of the NRLC is, quote, to protect and defend the most fundamental right of humankind, the right to life of every innocent human being from the beginning of life to natural death. One does not have to be a registered Republican or a registered Democrat to be a member. One doesn't need to be rich, doesn't need to be middling, doesn't need to be poor. No college degree is required for membership. The NRLC is not Jewish, it's not Christian, it's not Muslim, it's not Buddhist. A member can be an adherent of any faith or no faith at all to contribute to the organization's mission. People from all backgrounds, all beliefs, any ethnicity, any economic or educational level can join the NRLC. The only necessary component for membership in the NRLC and advancement of their agenda is to agree on the dignity of human life from conception to old age. Voluntary associations like the NRLC, or the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, the ISI, or the League of American Bicyclists, or any civic or political association. It gets citizens out of their homes and into fellowship with like-minded people. They put different people together, and their agendas foster cooperation in order to advance a common goal. They don't get distracted from their common mission by pursuing a bunch of other non-relevant issues. They are unified to advance a particular goal and unified to persuade others to join them in their pursuit of those goals. In gathering citizens together around a common goal, selfishness is mitigated because people are thinking about how to balance their own private interests with the good of the whole community. Voluntary associations also mitigate the power of majorities. It's much easier for the majority to impose its will on isolated dissenting individuals than it is upon organized and motivated associations with a unified message and pooled resources. And majorities are forced to deal with not merely one minority interest, but a lot of them at a time. And in this way, the power of majorities is undermined, which makes centralization of power harder to effect. And this is a strong preventative to tyranny. The more we associate together for common cause, the more we situate power in local communities, the more we secure independence from centralized power, the more liberty is protected. Now, public spirit and voluntary associations are only two of several democratic mindsets and practices that Tocqueville observed. The ingredient necessary for the success of liberty in a democracy was religion, particularly as the foundation of mores. So let's turn our attention to religion then. Now, Tocqueville was not all that religious. He was raised Catholic, he had a priest for a tutor, but by the time he was 16, he had become convinced that philosophy was a surer guide to truth than revealed religion. But even though he was at best a nominal Catholic, he still saw the absolute necessity of religion, and especially the Christian religion, to the sustenance of liberty. Tocqueville believed that Christianity was eminently suited to America, since the first settlers of America were often fleeing from religious persecution. They brought with them a desire to practice their religious convictions without any outside coercion. Now, this did not always mean they were willing to tolerate dissenters once they got here, but it did mean that they had firsthand experience of the individual pursuit of the meaning of ultimate truth according to their own convictions. So in describing the Puritans, Tocqueville said, "They brought to the New World a Christianity that I cannot portray better than by calling it democratic and republican." One reason for this was because Christianity relied on the persuasion of the mind rather than on physical compulsion. Furthermore, Tocqueville understood that the gospel understands human dignity in the context of fulfilling one's duties to one's fellows. For example, the command to look to others' needs prior to one's own is a universal command. And poverty and hardship are favored in the gospel over riches and ease. And since most people in the world are poor and hardship is universal, Christianity is a religion of equality of conditions. In addition to all this, Tocqueville was convinced by his experience in France and by his observations of Americans that religion was essential to liberty. The spirit of liberty and the spirit of religion, as he wrote, were intimately joined and reigned together over the same soil. And while in America there were denominations, there were sects, every religious group agreed on a set of common moral duties to one another. Tocqueville said, "Each sect worships God in its own way, but all sects preach the same morality in the name of God." Because of the fundamental moral agreement among Christians of various denominations, there can be no other place in the world other than America, according to Tocqueville, in which Christianity dominates society so thoroughly. And because of that fact, there can be no other place in the world than America in which there is found more freedom. Tocqueville wrote extensively about how democracy tends not toward liberty, but towards tyranny. Democracy tends toward tyranny because the essential quality of democracy is equality of conditions. Equality of conditions has the effect of leveling economic degrees, raising up those who are poor, bringing down those who are rich. And it also levels degrees of power in the same way. The leveling affected by equality of conditions leads to materialism. It leads to selfishness. It leads to isolation because human nature is selfish and materialistic. When citizens cease to care about the public good and spend all their time pursuing their private interests, they incline to look to the government to solve the public problems. The government is always happy to oblige because its power is consolidated and increased when citizens abrogate their civic responsibilities. And soon the power of the government becomes irresistible. But self-centered citizens find nothing to complain about as long as they get to keep and enjoy their creature comforts. This is part of the reason why Tocqueville argued that Americans would more quickly give up their freedom than they would their equality. Equality yields smaller and more insignificant blessings, but it does so instantly. Freedom's benefits are dearly bought and come slowly. So tyranny is more often the product of democracy because of the political, social, and economic leveling effects of equality of conditions. But religion lessens these deleterious effects because religion offers people an eternal and a communal perspective. Religion points people to their eternal destiny, which gets their attention off of their selfish ambitions and on things that are bigger than themselves. And religion teaches people to pursue their private interests ethically. Tocqueville said, religion will not succeed in turning men away from their love of riches, but they can still persuade them to enrich themselves by honest means. And finally, religion forms one of the primary bases of voluntary associations, as we've already seen. Voluntary associations get folks out of their homes, out of their private concerns, out into the concerns in the public square. And in a religious society, people get out of their houses and they go to church. They go serve the poor. They fellowship with their neighbors. They see that in their neighbors flourishing, they flourish. And in these ways, Tocqueville observed that religion was the most powerful political force in America. But there is a great irony in America, and that is that there was no established church. And yet, Tocqueville said, religion serves as the first of their political institutions. For if it does not give them a taste for liberty, it singularly facilitates their use of it. In Tocqueville's America, society had established the consensus that clergy ought never to involve themselves in politics for any reason at any time. Many states forbade clergy from holding public office, including New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Louisiana. All these states forbade their ministers from holding public office. Preachers in America, Tocqueville saw, did not take political positions, nor did they have any direct influence on public policy. They did, however, provide the theological and moral framework for laypersons who did influence the direction of public policy. So the fact that churches stay out of political squabbles made them invincible in American society. If the churches were to become political, they would become yet another faction open to attack. But since churches stay out of political wrangling, they maintained a dignified distance, and no one dared criticize the church. Churches realized that the price of being political was just simply not worth whatever benefit might be achieved. Church might gain some political influence, but it would be limited and it would be fleeting. It would ultimately lose its power and stature as the first political institution. And a political church would threaten democracy by undermining it as a force for stability. Like a political faction, it would be tossed by the waves of a fickle majority. So disestablishment of religion protected both the churches and democracy. And Tocqueville wrote that religion was the most powerful intellectual influence in America. Religion informed the mores, which influenced the laws, which regulated the state. He thought that one of the most important observations in his entire 2-volume book was that the mores of the people did more to secure liberty than any other single dynamic. He said, "So seriously do I insist upon this head, that if I have hitherto failed in making the reader feel the important influence of the practical experience, the habits, the opinions, in short, the customs Of the Americans, upon the maintenance of their institutions, I have failed in the principal object of my work. So Tutville observed that in America of 1831, religion informed the mores that undergirded the political, the social, the commercial life of the Republic, primarily through marriage, family life, which were indispensable to success in public life. For example, if a politician or a merchant was dishonest or unfaithful, they could not be successful in public or in private. So if a politician was found to be unfaithful to his wife, or if a merchant was found to be a cheater at home, then word would get out, and that dishonest person would be ruined, both at home and in public. Virtues are learned best through fulfillment of duties to one another, and marriage and the family are the primary institutions in which duties like that are learned. The Puritans, who Tocqueville saw as the spiritual parents of the Americans, they taught such morality. And Tocqueville thought that the Puritans of New England, through their strong sense of local community, their developed moral sensibility, succeeded best at balancing private and public interest. Americans of the 19th century, Tocqueville was convinced, had not yet abandoned that practice. So Tocqueville's America, the America that existed before the Civil War, was defined by a broad cultural agreement on Protestant religion and morality. American religious historians argue that Protestantism was as a cultural force was the strongest in the United States from the Revolution, which ended in 1783, to the Civil War, which ended in 1865. And this was due to the widespread reach of the revivals of the Second Great Awakening and the growth of free church denominational traditions like the Baptists, Methodists, Disciples of Christ. In other words, if America was ever a Protestant Christian nation, it was during this period more than any other period in US history. That Protestant consensus began to break down in the 1860s and continued to deteriorate for the next century. The trauma of the Civil War, the social, economic, and demographic changes due to immigration from the 1890s to the 1920s, the spread of the Industrial Revolution, westward expansion, the acquiring of overseas colonies after the Spanish-American War, the upheavals of the World Wars, the Depression, the fundamentalist modernist controversies of the 20s, and the technological revolution of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the social upheavals of the 1960s, all contributed to the breakdown of Protestant dominance of American culture. Today, American mores are influenced by celebrities, 24-hour news coverage, social media, movies, entertainment, a host of other non-religious sources which are often hostile to Christianity. It hardly needs to be said that much has changed in American culture since Tocqueville's visit in 1831. And because Tocqueville spent very little time in the South, he saw New England as being the paragon of American liberal democracy. America was a big country in 1831, and American society was not monolithic. He saw enough of the South to realize that a major part of the American population was still structured according to a form of feudalism in which an aristocracy ruled over an enslaved caste of people. Liberty and democracy were thus unevenly distributed in early America. And Tocqueville found that where religion did not have a strong influence on society's mores, slavery, race prejudice, sloth, violence, and indolence were the result. To close, let me tell you a quick story. In late November of 1831, Tocqueville and Beaumont traveled from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh in order to board a steamship bound for Cincinnati and then Louisville on their trip to the Mississippi River. Their travel was marred by the severest blizzard that anyone could ever remember. It took 72 hours for them to get across the mountains from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. Despite the beauty of the mountains and valleys of central Pennsylvania, Beaumont wrote that he could not enjoy the scenery because of the bleakness of the gray, leafless trees and the extreme cold. He said to his sister in a letter, "There are no pretty countrysides without verdure, greenness, and one is necessarily a cold admirer when freezing." And once they arrived in Pittsburgh, they boarded the steamship the 4th of July, which would take them down the river to Cincinnati. Their journey on the boat was much more comfortable than a carriage across the mountains, jarring and freezing them without any respite. Tocqueville could write in his diary about the country and Beaumont could write letters. It was warm inside the boat. Travel was much faster. And as they reached the city of Wheeling, Virginia, which is now West Virginia, the smooth travel on the river, however, turned into something of a living nightmare. During the night of November 26th, the 4th of July struck a massive rock in the middle of the channel of the Ohio River. The rock was a known obstacle in the channel called Burlington Bar. Immediately, the boat began to sink in the cold river with its 200 passengers, including the distinguished French travelers, Tutville and Beaumont. There were lifeboats available, but only sufficient to carry about 24 people. The ship was filling with water, and in Beaumont's telling, the two friends clasped each other's hands to said goodbye. But just before the boat was swamped and the passengers cast into the icy river, suddenly the boat abruptly stopped sinking. The boat became hung up on Burlington Bar, and even though she was fatally wounded by the obstacle, it was the gash in her hull that saved her by entangling her in the rock's conformation. And soon a ship named the William Parsons came along and rescued the stricken passengers of the 4th of July. Beaumont, Tutville, the other passengers were saved from certain death by drowning and by freezing. Now, how would the timeline have progressed had this episode ended differently? A fluke of physics delivered the most insightful foreign observer of American political and social institutions, delivered from certain death. Had he not survived, generations of people who would have benefited from his analysis would have been, of course, denied it. Our ability to make sense of American democracy would have been severely hindered. And the window to Jacksonian America that Tutville opened briefly to our gaze would have been closed to us. The Ohio River then serves as something like a metaphor for us. It was a highway bearing the travelers further into the interior of a country of which they had already learned so much. But it was also an insatiable and yawning leviathan that threatened to swallow them down to oblivion in an instant. And in Tocqueville's own estimation, as he wrote in the final chapter of Volume 1, the river was also a boundary between slavery on one side and freedom on the other, sloth on one side and industry on the other, vice on one side and virtue on the other, violence on one side and peace on the other. Tutville said it like this: upon the left bank, that between Kentucky and Ohio, the left bank of the stream, the population is sparse. From time to time, one descries a troop of slaves loitering in the half-desert fields. The primeval forest reappears at every turn. Society seems to be asleep, man to be idle, and nature alone offers a scene of activity and life. From the right bank, on the contrary, a confused hum is heard, which proclaims afar the presence of industry. Fields are covered with abundant harvests. The elegance of the dwellings announces the taste and activity of the laborers. And man appears to be in the enjoyment of that wealth and contentment, which is the reward of their labor. Slavery as an institution was degrading both to the master and to the enslaved. It degraded the master because it stole from him the dignity of work and the sense of duty to foster other people's flourishing and best interests. It degraded the enslaved because it encouraged rebellion, stole from him the benefits of his labor, and served as a sentence of death to himself and his friends and loved ones. And finally, slavery perverted the mores of Southern society and betrayed all the institutions of democratic America. But the real problem that Tocqueville saw on either side of the Ohio River was not slavery. Slavery could be, indeed had to be, abolished at some point. But even the abolition of slavery could not abolish the race prejudice that existed in the human heart. Tocqueville believed that it would be impossible for whites and free African Americans to live in any condition other than wholly equal and assimilated, or wholly separated. Moreover, African Americans would not abide being kept in a caste beneath the whites forever. At some point, they would demand redress against the inequalities they suffered. Tocqueville could ultimately see no solution to the race problem fostered by slavery than open strife and warfare between whites and blacks. Tocqueville said, all intermediate measures between emancipation and assimilation, total separation, or the continuation of slavery, seem to me likely to terminate in the most horrible of civil wars. Southerners saw the same profound threat and steadfastly refused to either free or intermingle with African Americans. Their solution was to continue to enslave them, and after Civil War had destroyed their land, people, and society, enslaved them by another system. Tocqueville had a unique perspective on the problem of race-based slavery in America. Was he the first person to point out the many ethical failures inherent to the institution of slavery? Certainly not. In fact, the same year that Tocqueville arrived in America, 1831, Nat Turner launched his slave revolt in Virginia, and William Lloyd Garrison began publishing his abolitionist periodical, The Liberator. Other influential figures of the day, Henry David Thoreau, for example, was a sharp critic of slavery. But Tocqueville was pointing out a subtle and yet much more insidious dynamic associated with slavery, and that was the problem of race hatred. He was among the first thinkers to confront this profound sin directly. Had he died in the Ohio River on that freezing night in November of 1831, his powerful insights on the connection between slavery and bigotry would have been lost to us. What would the ethics of Jesus Christ as revealed in Scripture done to more deeply influence the mores of the South in the early period of American national history? What would the result of Christ's command to love one another done to benefit white and Black people instead of slavery and Jim Crow? Unfortunately, we can only guess. But if Tocqueville was right about the benefits of Christian morality upon the mores, and the mores upon the laws, and the laws upon the regulation of the state, it is logical to assume that liberty would have prevailed over slavery in the South. It is a powerful lesson to us living in the 21st century. We are facing a moral crisis in our country, the likes of which we have not seen since the days leading up to the Civil War. Historian Mark Knoll called the Civil War a theological crisis because at its heart was an argument over how to interpret and apply the Christian scriptures to the principal moral issue of the day, slavery. We face a theological crisis also in that we are challenged to interpret and apply revealed truth about the sanctity of marriage, the dignity of human life, the freedom of the individual conscience before God, to a society that descends deeper and deeper into hostility toward God. Religion continues to be the moral and political basis for liberty in democratic America. Tocqueville was convinced of this truth, and it was a truth he took to his countrymen in France. His was a voice in the wilderness. Whether we heed Tocqueville's warnings, encouragements, wisdom, and lessons concerning how to guard liberty from democracy's tendency toward tyranny remains an open question. Let us hope and pray that people of goodwill in America, on either side of the partisan divide, can have ears to hear what Tocqueville has to say to us about liberty, what it is, what it costs, how to preserve it, and how to extend it to ourselves and to our posterity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wilsey. I know that you've given us a tremendous amount to think about and consider, and I really appreciate you being here and sharing with us your insights into securing liberty in a democracy. I don't know, it is 4:30 now. I'm not sure if you have a few minutes to hang out for questions. For those of you who have previous commitments and you need to meet those commitments, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your attention. And I pray that you take from this these truths and that they change and impact your life in ways that God would use them and use you. For those of you who can stay, who may have questions, please feel free to hang out in the room and we'll get a few of those questions before we have to say a final goodbye to Dr. Wilsey today. Thank you guys all for being here and for your support. Have a great day and a great week. All right. And so with that, let's see if we have any questions. There were no questions submitted in the question answer session. However, are there guests who are still with us now that have questions for Dr. Wilsey? I know they're hanging out. Somebody has questions. Let's see, go ahead. Let's see, is somebody raising their hand? Do you have a raise your hand feature here? I'm not sure if it's on webinar or not. Let's see if we have anything in the chat. All right, let's see. Sorry, this is my first time with the webinar features. I don't see a way for people to be acknowledged if they have questions. So if you do have those questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A and we'll read those aloud for everyone to hear. So we'll give you guys a minute. There comes one now. This is from Dr. Costin. He says, thanks for your presentation. To what do you attribute the apparent loss of community, the hermiting we see today? And what impact is that having on our democratic impulses these days?
Yeah, fantastic question. I think that social media has had an enormous impact in contributing to that hermiting dynamic, as you say, and very, very well put. Social media, I think, is, it gives us the sort of the illusion of distance from our interlocutors, both in good ways and bad ways. So, you know, in a good way, I might you know, tweet out, you know, a book that I thought was really good and say, hey, you should read this book. And there's a distance there from the people who I would like to encourage to read that book. But nevertheless, you know, it's a good thing for me to be able to do that, to tweet something out like that. But also it gives us the illusion of distance when we want to criticize. And that illusion of distance lets our criticisms take on a very caustic, insulting, you know, sort of violent sometimes character and nature. We don't see the person that we're criticizing. We're not looking that person in his or her face. So it's a lot easier for us to be ugly about it when we want to do that. When I teach online classes, I know that many of you who teach online classes can identify with this. I have found that I get more complaints from students in an online class than I get from students in a traditional class where they're present in the classroom. And I get more nasty, mean emails from students, usually in an online class, than I would in an in-person class. And I think it's because of that illusion of power that we get from the distance we receive. We have anonymity. You know, we don't have to be held accountable all the time for what we say on social media because we can do it anonymously. You can go on Twitter and you can establish an anonymous, you know, handle. It doesn't have your name or picture on it. And you can say whatever you want. And sometimes those can be very, very, have a huge following and be very destructive. So I think that social media has a lot of benefits to it. It can be a wonderful thing, but like many things in creation, they're blessings, but they can have a terribly deleterious effect on human relationships and on societal coherence. And that's just one of the many things, but I think that's one of the more recent things. And it's one of the things that we have not yet figured out how to navigate through. It's problems that we really don't know how to resolve. We don't want to get rid of social media. We can't do that. That ship has sailed. But then how do we, you know, how do we navigate those very, really still very new and innovative kind of problems that we see? So, you know, that's a big question. And I would say social media is a big factor and the hermetization, as you say, of society. So, Dr. Phillips, you have a question in the chat box that I'll address. How does Tutville's assessment of Christianity in the South fit with the South's sense of being a bastion of Christian faith? Tocqueville didn't spend a lot of time in the South. He did travel down to New Orleans on the Mississippi River, and he did travel through what was known at the time as the Black Belt, which was the highest concentration of African Americans in slavery in the South. So through central Mississippi, Alabama, central Georgia, he went to Savannah. I believe he was in Charleston for a short time. He went up to Wilmington, North Carolina, and thence on to Washington, D.C. But it was a whirlwind tour. He didn't spend much time. He didn't write about much of the South. So he didn't really talk about the religion of the South, but he did sort of draw a conclusion, sort of an argument from the best explanation. Given slavery, given race prejudice, given what he called a feudalistic order, an aristocratic order in the South that did not exist in New England, that religion could not have been as strong as a social influence in the South as it was in the North. And that can really be borne out in history. Puritan New England is the most religiously informed region in North America from the 1600s well into the 19th century. And an argument can be made into the 20th century as well. And in the South, as you know, the colonies in the South, they were established mainly as Anglican, with the exception of Maryland, which was established originally as Catholic, but became Anglican. And the established Anglican orders were less sort of powerful to unite all aspects of society. Like the Puritans, that was their goal, to unite every aspect of society under the lordship of Christ. Whereas the Anglican societies, they were very religious. They were very, very aware of God in their lives, but they were less concerned with uniting all elements of life together under a unified Christian worldview. And the Second Great Awakening will have a big influence, but as you know, Second Great Awakening in the South is going to be heavily influenced by Campbellitism, which is going to be very individualistic, non-creedal, and a rejection and a sort of a throwing off of old traditional forms of religious authority. So in that regard, religion in the South is in reality not going to have the kind of influence as it does in the North in the early 19th century. Now, of course, Southerners will make the claim that they were much more religious by the time you get to the 1850s, 1860s, and then in the years and decades after the Civil War. But that really was mythological. It's really more part of a lost cause mythology than it was really borne out in reality. Yeah. It's a great question.
Okay, are there any other questions? All right. I don't see any more questions, so we have a quiet audience today. Thank you again so much for being here. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and you've given us, my students and I, much to think about and consider. So thank you again. Ben, any final thoughts?
No, but thank you, Dr. Wilsey. It's great to have you, and I really appreciate the way you provoke us to think about how all these things fit together. And here at Charleston Southernist, we're putting a really high emphasis on faith integration, on the integration of the Christian faith with learning, leading, and serving. De Tocqueville really helps us to see how that's important in our influence in society, and particularly in law and government. That continues to be true today. So thank you for feeding that aspect of who we are and what we're trying to be here at Charleston Southern.
Well, listen, thank you so much for inviting me. This has been such a great treat. It's great to see you, Ben. It's good to see you. I don't think I've seen you since since Houston. I don't know. Maybe we've seen each other maybe a couple of times, but it's great to see you again. Dr. Gramling, it's great to meet you more in person. Not really in person, but more in person than the phone.
Exactly. As close as we can get right now.
As close as we can get. And this has just been a great treat. And I really, really appreciate you inviting me. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
God bless.
All right. Well, blessings to everyone. And I hope that you will have a wonderful week. And don't forget Constitution Day on Thursday. Think about that. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
God bless you.